Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, tons of people are either in the endgame itself or reaching the endgame in Path of Exile 2's early access, with some people quite deep within the systems. As you reach the map device and maps as a concept, multiple new endgame activities will open up to you and be present on the various maps. One of these is expeditions. This is the symbol that shows these being on a map. You can add more to your available maps by using expedition precursor tablets within Lost Towers, which will have further bonus effects. Today we're going to talk about expeditions as a map activity, just the basics of how it works, then we'll talk about the rewards that you can get from this and what they can be worth. We'll go over logbooks as a whole extra layer of activity tied directly to these expeditions, and how these can differ from the expeditions in the map device itself. Then of course the Pinnacle boss that is tied to expeditions as a system, any tips for beating it easier, and the drops that you're looking for when you do find and kill them. Starting off then with expeditions on maps to begin with, when you go on a map that has one of these symbols here, you will eventually, while exploring, come across this big smattering of remnants with modifiers on them surrounding a tent with an NPC. The NPC that is here varies with each expedition, it doesn't matter much, and the first time that you meet each one, you then unlock them to place within your hideout so you can trade with them afterwards. For this activity, you are given a number of explosives, told to place them within the radius of the activity itself, and then detonate them once you are done. Doing this will make monsters pop up, chests pop up, loot, and depending on the remnants that you chose and modifiers selected, this can get a little bit chaotic once it starts going off, but if you know how to take advantage of this system the best, you can actually get a lot more from it than most people would assume. This is, in my opinion, the most undervalued endgame activity at the immediate moment. Sure, if you have an absolute blaster build, then Breach and Delirium maps are awesome to take part in. They are extremely dense and fast, but expeditions reward a bit more thought and knowledge over just pure clear speed. That said, let's talk about your explosives to begin with. There are three important things to detonate in the map version of expeditions. These little swirly symbols represent excavated chests. These are just chests that you can open after exploding them up, with the color of the symbol representing the rarity of the chest. These little stones with the modifiers are called remnants, and blowing them up doesn't give you extra monster spawns or loot within itself. It simply adds modifiers to the explosions that will happen afterwards, and the one that explodes the remnant itself. A lot of people upon first glance at this activity will not really understand what most of the markers mean, and just try to get as many as the modifiers as possible. They'll aim for the remnants because the only thing that throws text on top of them, but this is actually usually the wrong way to go about it, as the modifiers only affect what you already dig up. When you blow up a remnant, its modifier applies to that explosion, and then every explosion that happens afterwards. So let's say you find a remnant that has increased quantity of logbooks dropped or increased quantity of rare runic monsters. It would only affect the explosion that blows up that remnant or the ones that happen afterwards. Nothing that happens before that will have those modifiers. So the actual sequence of your detonation string, your explosion chain, matters arguably more than the specific places you choose to explode a lot of the time, at least when it comes to the remnants. That said, most remnant positives aren't a big deal aside from increased rarity of monsters or quantity of items or anything that specifically affects logbooks, because logbooks are a big deal. Aside from that, just make a point of avoiding really negative modifiers on the remnants, like immunity to damage types that you do, 100% of extra damage as a certain damage type, or monsters penetrating resistances can also be quite nasty too. Then the third markers are the least noticeable, but most important once you realize what they actually do. They're the sort of larger staffs sticking out of the ground with hoops or rings on them, whatever you want to call them, and these mark runic monster spawns. Runic monsters are the ones that get specifically buffed by things like the Atlas tree or the precursor tablets. They can be given increased chance of logbooks dropping from any of these things, and also the modifiers on the actual remnants themselves, like we talked about, and logbooks are the real value from this activity as a whole. So on maps, your goal is to maximize runic monsters, quantity and rarity for these, and then just any excavated chests past that, as excavated chests also do have a chance to drop logbooks. Here's an example of one of these I did earlier. A little tip here: if you want to be ultra safe, you can't clear out the whole map before actually interacting with the expedition on it. It doesn't activate things until you start working with it. It doesn't lose anything from nearby monsters being dead, so you can complete a map entirely that has an expedition on it by getting rid of all the rares and everything else, then come and do the expedition at the very end if you want to do it that way. This one had good rolls on the actual remnants, really a lot of potential for bonus quantity of logbook spawns from runic monsters, which is like the absolute top tier modifier. Some of them I couldn't take because they would be terrible with my build or the pathing was bad, but aside from that, the goal is simply to path to the closest just increase the logbook's remnant from the start of the activity so I can have it for as many spawns of monsters as possible, then path as effectively as possible through to the other remnants that boost logbook spawns, while also trying to catch as many runic monsters as possible as a high priority, and then also then just grabbing any of the excavated chests within range when it makes sense to do so, without giving up the 2 higher priorities I already talked about first. Then you interact with the detonator to set off the chain of explosions, and they will go off in the order that you place them, one at a time, revealing monsters and or chests as they pop. That said, as mentioned, the big ticket here from this activity on the maps themselves are logbooks. These are just basically full map scale expeditions that you do separately from this, with tons of potential rewards, especially if you get the Pinnacle boss spawn. For maximum potency, you want logbooks that are at least level 79, as that is when you start to have a chance of the Pinnacle boss showing up, who we'll talk about in more detail later on. To get higher level logbooks, you need to do expeditions on higher tier maps, or through raising area level on maps too, through the irradiated or corrupted modifiers, which each raise the area level as well. On top of making you have better logbooks when they drop too, this also just increases loot quality and quantity in general, which of course makes the expeditions better to begin with. If you want to maximize this even further through the waystones that you use, you want increased quantity and rarity of items as prefix modifiers. You can ensure that you get maximum prefix modifiers on a white waystone by using an omen of sinistral alchemy and then using an orb of alchemy on that map. This gives you 3 of your 4 modifiers rolled on the map as prefixes, which is what gives you the highest chances of getting item quantity and rarity modifiers. The other main thing that you can do is use the precursor tablets as mentioned earlier. These ones, for expeditions specifically, will drop from expeditions in maps, but also from logbooks themselves when you do run them. An ideal expedition precursor tablet, in my opinion, is increased quantity of expedition logbooks dropped by runic monsters and increased number of rare expedition monsters in your maps, or increased runic monster markers as a modifier is pretty good as well, and these just all overlap very nicely to give you very valuable runic monster spawns, which is generally something that you're after. Other than that, explosive radius and placement range aren't bad by any means, and of course things like generally increased rarity of items also does affect the activity, and all of these things can also appear on logbooks themselves too as modifiers as well. That goes into a bit more of the general map system advice though, but you first want to set up your web of lost towers by traversing through maps with bad layouts directly to the towers. Things like crypts, Val Factory, or Augury are just clumped up, cramped, and uncomfortable to do, so you want to do them on your less juiced waystones, even on lower tiers if you really want to speed it up. Use them to get to the different towers, then put in the tablets that matter, and run the maps that you actually want to do that will now have expeditions on top of them. I also recommend using one tablet that makes maps irradiated for every 4 or so expedition tablets, even when farming expedition, just because that lets you consistently raise the area level a bit more, as long as you can handle that difficulty bump, of course, as again, increased area level is important for getting better drops. That said, aside from logbooks, the main drops that you'll be getting during expedition are artifacts and exotic coinage. These can be used to trade with the artifact NPCs within your hideout, each of which specializing in different item types, and so each currency has its own value as a result. Tujin sells rings, amulets, and belts, and so generally this one is the most sought after by a lot of players, as it's the easiest one to work within with the weird crafting system that is attached to the system, and so that tends to be the most valuable of the materials outside of exotic coinage. The quick and consistent way to make profit from these is, however, simply to throw them into a blender in the currency exchange. Especially exotic coinage goes for a couple of exalts apiece, most average, but let's also talk about how the vendors work themselves if you do want to interact with them properly. Each of them has their own stock of base items. These can be reset using the exotic coinage in the bottom corner, but they will always stick to the same general item types, just change their stock within that. You pay the artifact specific to that vendor to get the item by itself in the first place, then you'll be offered the opportunity to make a large change to the item. Something like rerolling all of the prefix modifiers or all of the suffix modifiers, rerolling tiers, or removing a specific modifier, adding one modifier, removing one modifier, things like that. If you agree to the craft that is offered to you, it will be relatively cheap, and the next one will stay cheap if you take it. If you skip a craft, it increases the cost of subsequent crafts, and you cannot skip 2 in a row. If you try to do that, you'll just have to take the item. To try and simplify this, you can use this system to handpick items that you are offered from the actual vendors, and then alter them with random options that you can either choose to take or not take based on whether you want to or not. You can use this to create good items, but there is an absolute ton of RNG involved in this part of the system. almost as much as just like crafting by itself to begin with. For pure efficiency, you can always just sell off the artifacts in Coinage, with exotic Coinage, sun artifacts, and the black scythe artifacts too, generally being the most valuable of these, but it is absolutely possible to make a lot of orbs from this crafting system if you get good at using it correctly and get some luck too. But it is generally just a lot of RNG, so I would say that it's important to know how to do it, which is why we went over it, but I wouldn't think about it too much unless you're really attached. Moving on, then, let's talk about the Atlas points for this system, and then we'll dive into logbooks properly. You unlock skill points for the expedition section of the Atlas when you defeat Ulroth, the Pinnacle boss for this activity. He has a random chance of existing within logbooks that are area level 79 or higher. You'll know when you found him if you see a big skull marker within your logbook on a sort of like little structure. Detonate that and you will spawn the boss, with 2 skill points gained for your first kill on each difficulty, up to 8 maximum. For spending your points when actually running logbooks, you want to run it at the highest difficulty that you physically can, only dropping lower if you aren't strong enough yet. You can maximize this by just sticking the points in the close-up difficulty nodes in your Atlas before doing your logbooks, and then when going to do regular expeditions on maps instead, you would refund the points and instead move them over to Disturbed Rest, highest priority, as this gives you increased runic monster markers on your map, so higher likelihood of logbooks dropping, then Detailed Records, which gives you increased quantity of expedition logbooks dropped by runic monsters in general within maps, and then also gives 3 modifiers to all logbooks automatically, which is also quite nice. Then you would want timed detonations. This gives you increased quantity of artifacts dropped by monsters in maps and faster detonation chain explosions, which is just sort of a bonus. Mostly this just lets you get to legendary battles as the final node with your final 2 points, which increases rare expedition monsters in maps and increases exotic coinage drops, which are the most valuable of the actual currency from this activity to just either use in the crafting system or selling at the currency exchange. To reiterate the earlier point, all of the actual nodes that give us effects here only affect expeditions on maps, not the logbooks themselves. So when running the logbook specifically, you actually want to sort of reshuffle your points and get as many difficulty nodes as you can handle instead, refunding these Atlas points whether you're going to be doing logbooks or just expeditions on the maps themselves. All that said, let's now talk about the logbooks themselves. The area the logbook map brings you to will decide the type of artifacts that are dropped. For the most part, the system is just like a big extended and expanded version of the expeditions that you do within maps, but within its own entire area. The concepts that you focus on here and the way that it works is largely the same, but with a few key differences. First, you're given a lot more explosives. There'll be a lot more sort of markers with symbols on them representing loot that you can dig up. Most of them are related to various equipment slots. They can represent currency. The spirals generally still represent chests or artifacts, which are a big reason that you're here to begin with. There are underground areas that you can get on occasion. You'll see them marked on your minimap, and then you can open up if you explode right next to them, and these can lead you to some bonus chests in a little room, so detonating them is usually worth it if you have the option. And then of course, Ulroth, the Pinnacle boss. In area level 79 or higher logbooks, you can at random find a map marker in them with a big skull on it. It's a building that you can destroy with an explosion, and detonating this will open up the path to go and fight Ulroth, the expedition Pinnacle boss. Supposedly, through what a lot of players are saying, this is about a 1 in 5 chance or so of happening when on the correct level logbooks. However, I've now ran around 10 logbooks of this level myself and not had any luck personally, so keep in mind that this is a particularly RNG Pinnacle boss to have come up to begin with, and you can't even trade for guaranteed spawns like the other Pinnacle bosses because of how this system works. Moving on then, I won't walk you through the whole fight for him, as most of his attacks are just sort of standard melee moves, swinging his sword around, forward lunges, stuff like that, but he has a few attacks that can be quite nasty if you aren't prepared for them. He has one where he drops a spiral of lasers down above you. This one you just sort of have to roll out of it, recognize that it's happening before all the beams are overlapping and hitting you at the same time, and after they converge in the middle, they spiral back outwards, so give it some space after you do the roll too. There is also a spiral that looks like the expedition symbol itself that will be constantly rotating around the boss platform. Occasionally this will start firing a laser at you with a bit of splash radius around where it hits the ground as well. Avoid this one by simply moving perpendicular to the laser itself so you don't hit a closer section of it while walking away, and this one is cold damage too, so it's worth noting that you want to avoid this. It's very important if, you don't want to get frozen. So as well, having a bunch of bonus freeze threshold here, either from your skill points or anywhere else, is quite useful. He also has a move where he just sort of stands there, lifts up his hands and laughs, and then forces his sword into the ground to create a patch of freezing ground that continually pulses for cold damage if you are standing in it. The next major thing of note is when you drop him down to low health, he will kneel down and get a full health reset for phase 2. Nothing seems to majorly change in phase 2 as far as like new additions, but he does get a lot more chaotic. He causes a lot more overlapping between his earlier attacks, making you deal with multiple of them at the same time. On higher difficulties in the first tier, the boss will also have 3 portals portals on the sides of the platform that will summon and adds extra bonus monsters, so be ready for those to show up too. Then finally, let's talk about the actual rewards from Olroth himself. He has 5 unique drops. The highest value across the board is the unique life flask that he drops. This gives you instant recovery at the cost of increased charges per use, but any excess life recovery applies as guard for 10 seconds. Guard is a separate defensive layer from anything else that we have. Essentially think of it like energy shield, but it gets taken from before energy shield itself. So if you have 900 guard and 900 energy shield, you can take 900 damage before your energy shield goes down at all. This is specifically very useful for anyone running something like Chaos Inoculation, as this sets your life to 1 anyways, and this lets your life flask still have actual value for you even with 1 maximum life in those types of builds. As far as the actual trade value of this flask, these are currently sitting at around 30 divines each at the time of writing this, so if you have 1 drop and don't intend to use it, that's a pretty valuable trade that you can then make. Next up then are the Heroic Tragedy Timeless Jewels, which are incredibly difficult to properly explain in a quick manner, but they basically change the effects of passives within their radius when you put them into a jewel socket in your passive tree. The actual effect of the jewel depends on the number that you see in the tooltip, and as of right now, this isn't something you can really just easily search up without having the jewel and slotting it in for yourself to look at it. As a result, their actual value is very uncertain to most players. There is randomness involved, quite a bit of it, and currently we just know a smattering of what is possible to be rolled on passives affected by this jewel, with the keystones being knightly tenets, which changes dexterity as an attribute to give you increased armor instead of accuracy as its inherent bonus, black scythe training, which makes intelligence give you increased evasion rating instead of maximum mana as its inherent bonus, and circular teachings, which makes strength give you bonus energy shield instead of maximum life as its inherent bonus. Then there's just a ton of notables that this can also give you access to, with various quite interesting effects as well. If you do have one of these drop, see what you roll by putting it into the drill socket, see how you feel about it, and then otherwise you can just try and sell it and see if someone else bites. The next item of particular note is the Fallen Crucible Tower Shield. This is seeing heavy use on warriors right now, especially for warbringers, because they have an ascendancy node that can set the base block chance of shields up to 40%. That makes this shield specifically way stronger, especially with lucky block chance modifier still being active, and this one is going for around 40 exalted orbs apiece at the time of making this, and the other 2 uniques that this boss drops are honestly pretty irrelevant right now, one being the Keeper of the Arc Helmet, the other being the Visara Torment Club. That pretty much does it for today, everyone. Your full guide on the expeditions as an endgame mechanic in early access for Path of Exile 2, how to maximize the value of the activity within maps, the logbook system, your atlas points, the Pinnacle boss, and all that goodness. Hopefully you've gotten some value out of this video, and if you have any expedition related tips of your own for other players, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.